A bear was crying to lure a man into the woods. What he found after following it will leave you speechless. The late afternoon sun cast golden streaks through the thick canopy, dappling the forest floor with a warm glow. Lucas adjusted the strap of his canvas bag and glanced at the trees around him. This forest, dense and untouched, was supposed to be perfect for what he needed. The presentation was tomorrow, the plight of endangered species, and he wanted more than just textbook facts. He hoped to find something real, tangible, to hold in his hands when he spoke to his classmates. The familiar crunch of fallen leaves underfoot was comforting as he ventured deeper. The forest seemed alive, yet strangely subdued, with faint rustlings of unseen creatures in the underbrush. A faint uneasiness stirred within him. He brushed it off and focused on the task at hand. A bird call echoed faintly in the distance, followed by the whisper of wind threading through the branches. Then he saw it. At first it was just a shadow between the trees, a mass that didn't belong to the natural shapes of the forest. Lucas stopped, heart thumping loudly as the form shifted and stepped into the light. It was a bear, a brown bear, massive in size but clearly not in its prime. Its fur hung in matted clumps, streaked with dirt and signs of old injuries. Fresh blood oozed sluggishly from deep gashes on its legs. But the most striking feature was its eyes, tired, sunken, as if carrying a weight beyond pain. Panic swept over Lucas. His pulse quickened, and his mind raced through every survival tip he had ever read. His instincts screamed at him to lie still, to not make a sound. He dropped to the ground, his cheek pressing against the cool earth, his breathing shallow. Minutes crawled by, stretching endlessly. Every rustle of leaves, every crackle of twigs made Lucas brace for the worst. Yet nothing came. No growls, no thunderous charge of paws. Finally, against his better judgment, he cracked one eye open. The bear was still there. It wasn't attacking. It wasn't moving at all, save for the slow rise and fall of its massive chest. It was sitting, almost as if waiting. Its gaze rested on Lucas, calm yet expectant, like a teacher waiting for a student to look up. Lucas's muscles ached from holding still, but curiosity was beginning to eclipse his fear. Slowly, cautiously, he raised his head. His heart still pounded, but his hands had stopped trembling. The bear tilted its head ever so slightly, its expression unreadable, yet oddly gentle. "What do you want?" Lucas whispered, the words barely audible. The bear did not respond, of course, but neither did it react aggressively. Instead, it shifted its massive bulk and rose to its feet. Lucas tensed, ready to flee, but the bear didn't approach him. It turned, lumbering away through the trees. After a few steps, it paused and glanced back over its shoulder, as if checking to see if Lucas was following. He stared after it, frozen by indecision. This was insane. No one in their right mind would follow a bear into the forest. But then again, nothing about this situation felt normal. That gaze, that stillness, it was as if the bear wasn't just an animal. It was something more. His thoughts swirled with doubt and unease. Was this some bizarre trap? Was he imagining things? Yet a pull stronger than fear began to take hold. The bear moved again, a slow, deliberate pace, its head turning occasionally to ensure Lucas was still watching. Lucas inhaled sharply, as though he needed to anchor himself in the present moment. Then, without fully understanding why, he pushed himself to his feet and took a hesitant step forward. The bear didn't react, continuing its measured path deeper into the forest. Lucas followed at a cautious distance, his eyes darting to the bear's wounds, its uneven gait. There was a quiet dignity to its movements, a determination that Lucas couldn't help but respect. The light began to fade, as the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows that reached hungrily across the forest floor. The air felt heavier, cooler, as they ventured deeper into the woods. Lucas's mind churned with questions. Where was it taking him? Why had it waited for him? And above all, what was he hoping to find? Step by step, the forest grew darker, the trail less defined. Lucas adjusted his bag again, his resolve strengthening. Whatever this was, whatever strange, inexplicable event he had stumbled into, it felt too important to walk away from. Ahead, the bear plodded on, its form silhouetted against the last rays of sunlight. Lucas followed, his heart both heavy and hopeful, stepping into the unknown. The forest seemed to shift as Lucas followed the bear. Each step he took felt purposeful, as though he were treading on a path he was meant to find. The air was cooler here, damp with the scent of earth and moss. The further he went, the more the world around him seemed to change. He couldn't quite put his finger on it, but something about this place tugged at his memory. The way the trees bent in peculiar shapes, their gnarled branches curling like ancient hands, felt oddly familiar. A trickle of unease mingled with curiosity. It was the kind of sensation one gets when standing in a place long forgotten, but somehow remembered in dreams. The bear moved steadily ahead, its steps deliberate, as if it knew every root and stone on the path. Lucas hesitated now and then, his breath hitching when the bear glanced back at him. Its amber eyes, even in their weariness, held a strange calm, urging him forward. The trees thickened, their shadows stretching longer as the daylight waned. The path grew narrower, lined with tangled undergrowth that snagged Lucas's jeans and slowed his steps. The bear, however, moved with ease, skirting obstacles with surprising agility for such a massive creature. Ahead, the sound of rushing water broke the silence. Lucas quickened his pace, weaving through the trees until he reached a clearing. A wide river cut through the forest, its surface rippling with an unforgiving current. Lucas stopped, his chest tightening at the sight of a rickety bridge spanning the water. It wasn't much of a bridge, more a haphazard collection of logs and vines that sagged under its own weight. The bear stepped onto it without hesitation, its massive paws testing each timber with care. Lucas watched, his throat dry, as the bridge creaked and swayed beneath the bear's weight. "No way," Lucas whispered, shaking his head. "That thing's going to snap any second." The bear reached the other side and turned to look at him. Its gaze was steady, almost expectant. Lucas felt a lump rise in his throat. He glanced at the water, the roaring sound of the current pounding in his ears. A fall from that height would be unforgiving. He forced himself to breathe. "You're out of your mind," he muttered to himself, gripping the frayed rope railing as he stepped onto the first log. The bridge groaned under his weight, and his heart hammered in his chest. One step, then another. The logs shifted beneath him, the vines creaking like old bones. He tried not to look down, focusing instead on the bear waiting patiently on the other side. The gap between them felt enormous, the distance stretching further with every cautious step. Halfway across, a gust of wind swept through the clearing, causing the bridge to sway. Lucas froze, gripping the ropes tighter, his knuckles white. For a moment, he felt the weight of the forest around him, the vastness of it pressing down on his small, trembling form. The bear didn't move. It simply stood there, its calm presence anchoring Lucas's fear. "Okay," Lucas whispered, "just a little further." He forced his feet to move, inching towards solid ground. With one last leap, he stepped onto the opposite bank, his legs shaking beneath him. He looked back at the bridge, then at the bear. "You could have warned me," he muttered, though he knew the absurdity of speaking to it. The bear turned and continued on its way, unbothered by Lucas's struggles. Lucas followed again, though something had shifted within him. The fear that had clung to him earlier now felt muted, replaced by an inexplicable sense of trust. This creature, battered and worn as it was, seemed to know what it was doing. The forest grew darker as they ventured further. The once familiar sounds of birds and rustling leaves faded, replaced by a heavy silence. Lucas adjusted the strap of his bag and kept moving, his eyes scanning the shadows. Then he saw it, a shape looming ahead, barely visible through the trees. As they drew closer, the outline of a large structure emerged, its edges softened by creeping vines and decay. Lucas stopped in his tracks, his breath catching in his throat. It was a circus tent, or at least what was left of one. The canvas was tattered and discolored, sagging under the weight of time. Broken cages, their bars rusted and bent, dotted the area like forgotten relics. The air felt heavier here, thick with something Lucas couldn't name. The bear stopped just short of the clearing, sitting down as if to wait. Lucas's gaze darted from the tent to the bear, a knot forming in his stomach. "What is this place?" he whispered. The question lingered in the air, unanswered, as Lucas took his first step toward the forgotten ruin. The sight before Lucas felt unreal. What had once been a place of wonder, laughter, and applause was now a hollowed-out shadow of its former self. The tattered remains of a faded red and yellow circus tent swayed gently in the breeze, its once bright colors dulled to muted shades of gray and brown. Bent iron poles, rusted through time and neglect, jutted at odd angles like forgotten sentinels guarding the ruins. Lucas stepped forward, his boots crunching on broken glass and debris. The heavy air seemed to settle on him like a weight, pressing against his chest. The sounds of the forest faded into the background, replaced by an eerie, oppressive silence. Scattered around the clearing were the remnants of the circus's former glory. A collapsed Ferris wheel loomed in the distance, its skeletal frame tangled in vines. Broken cages, their bars warped and stained with rust, lay abandoned, as if the wild animals they once held had long since escaped or perished. Lucas froze as a flicker of recognition stirred within him. This place wasn't unfamiliar. The sensation hit him like a sudden gust of cold wind, prickling the back of his neck. Memories, dormant for years, began to surface. He'd been here before, as a child. His breath caught as images flashed through his mind, holding his father's hand, the smell of popcorn and sawdust, the excited chatter of a crowd. It had been 10 years ago, during a chilly November weekend before Thanksgiving. His father, David Stephen, had brought him here to watch the animals perform. Lucas could still recall the twinkle in his father's eyes as he explained the behavior of the elephants, the agility of the tigers. But that had been the last time he'd seen his father. The memory sharpened, painful, and raw. His father had disappeared that very weekend, leaving no trace. The search parties had scoured the forest and nearby towns, but they found nothing. Lucas and his mother had left the area soon after, unable to bear the weight of uncertainty and loss. They had never spoken about the circus again. Yet here it was, standing like a ghost from his past, bringing with it a flood of emotions he had tried to bury. A rustling sound pulled Lucas from his thoughts. He turned to see the bear, now standing near a massive, empty cage. Its frame was larger than the others, its iron bars twisted as if some great force had bent them. The bear lowered its head and paused, motionless, as if paying homage to the place. Lucas's chest tightened. Was this where it had been kept, forced to perform for crowds who cheered while it suffered in silence? The thought struck him deeply, and he felt a pang of sorrow that went beyond words. The bear lifted its head slightly, its gaze drifting across the clearing. Lucas followed its line of sight to another cage, smaller but still intact. Inside, a tiger lay curled in the shadows, its once majestic coat now dull and patchy. The animal's ribs showed beneath its thin skin, and its eyes glimmered faintly, dulled by exhaustion and despair. Nearby, an elephant stood in a makeshift pen, swaying gently from side to side. Its massive frame seemed diminished by age and neglect, and its trunk occasionally reached out as if searching for something. Perhaps comfort, perhaps hope. Lucas felt a lump rise in his throat. He wanted to look away, but he couldn't. The sight of these creatures, so broken yet still alive, filled him with a deep, aching sadness. He thought of his father again, how passionate he'd been about protecting animals, how he'd spoken of them as if they were equals, deserving of respect and care. The bear moved again, drawing Lucas's attention back. It stopped in front of the large, empty cage and lowered itself to the ground. Its head dipped slightly, almost reverently, and for the first time, Lucas saw it as more than a wild animal. This bear had a story, a history of suffering and survival that mirrored the desolation around them. Lucas stepped closer, his heart pounding with a mix of awe and sorrow. He knelt a short distance from the bear, his gaze fixed on its massive frame. "This was your cage," he whispered, the words barely audible. "Wasn't it?" The bear didn't respond, of course, but there was something in the way it sat, still, solemn, that answered his question. Lucas's hands curled into fists at his sides. He could feel the anger rising within him, not at the bear or the circus, but at the people who had allowed this to happen, the same people who had likely taken his father, the same ones who had left these creatures to rot. His eyes met the bear's, and, for a moment, they shared a quiet understanding. Whatever had brought him here, whatever had drawn him to this forgotten place, it wasn't over. The circus held answers. He could feel it. And Lucas wasn't leaving until he found them. Lucas moved cautiously, his footsteps muffled by dirt and decaying leaves. Behind him, the bear lumbered quietly, its massive frame almost ghost-like in the dim light. Lucas's heart raced with a growing sense of urgency. The animals he had seen, thin, weak, their gazes hollow, could not wait much longer. Ahead, he spotted a row of rusting cages. The sight made his chest tighten. He hurried toward them, the bear following close behind. The first cage held nothing. Rusted bars bent inward, and the ground inside was scattered with old straw, damp and rotting. But then a sound, a low, guttural groan came from the far end of the row. Lucas turned, his eyes scanning, until he spotted movement in the shadows. It was a gorilla. The animal was hunched in a corner, its once powerful body reduced to a pitiful state. Its fur was patchy, its movements sluggish. Lucas knelt near the cage, his voice soft. "Hey there," he whispered. "I'm going to get you out of here." The gorilla's dark eyes met his, reflecting exhaustion but also a flicker of hope. Lucas searched for a way to open the rusted lock, but it was jammed tight, the mechanism long fused by time and neglect. The bear stood nearby, watching Lucas's every move. "Come on," Lucas muttered, gripping the lock with trembling hands. "We have to get you out." He glanced at the bear, as if expecting it to understand. In a strange way, it seemed to. The bear shifted closer, sniffing the lock and nudging it with its nose, but it didn't budge. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. Lucas's frustration grew. His hands scraped and raw from trying to force the lock. The sense of helplessness was crushing. Finally, with a sharp twist, the rusted metal gave way, and the cage door creaked open. The gorilla hesitated, its massive hand resting on the edge of the cage, as though unsure of its newfound freedom. "It's okay," Lucas said softly. "You're free now." The animal stepped out, moving gingerly, its movements stiff. Lucas watched it for a moment, relief mixing with a pang of sorrow. One life saved. But how many others had already been lost? He stood and looked back at the bear. Its gaze was steady, as if urging him to press on. The deeper Lucas went into the remains of the circus, the darker the atmosphere became. The once bright colors of the tents had faded to drab, lifeless hues. Broken equipment lay scattered. A Ferris wheel loomed in the distance, its skeletal frame swaying in the wind. But what drew Lucas's attention most were the cages, row after row of them, all empty. He could imagine the creatures that once filled these rusted prisons: tigers pacing, parrots squawking, elephants swaying in endless repetition. The silence now was deafening, a grim testament to the horrors that had unfolded here. His search led him to a small office tucked into the back corner of the grounds. The door hung crookedly on its hinges, and the floor was littered with crumpled papers and broken furniture. Lucas knelt and began sifting through the mess. Most of the documents were faded and brittle, their ink smudged with time, but some pages remained legible. His eyes widened as he read names, species listed one after another: Bengal tiger, snow leopard, western lowland gorilla. Notes in the margins detailed transactions, dates, and destinations. "This was it," Lucas murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. This was where it all happened. He shoved the papers into his bag, his hands trembling. The weight of it all was overwhelming, proof of a monstrous operation hidden in the heart of the forest. As he turned to leave, something on the far desk caught his eye. A hat. It was old, its brim worn and frayed, but unmistakable. Lucas reached for it, his breath catching as he flipped it over. The name stitched inside made his knees weaken. David Stephen. His father's name. The memories came rushing back. His father's gentle voice. The way he always wore this hat on their outings to the woods. The day he disappeared, Lucas had clung to the hope that he'd come back. But here, in this forsaken place, the truth was beginning to take shape. He clutched the hat tightly, his mind racing. What had his father been doing here? Was he part of this nightmare, or had he tried to stop it? Lucas pulled out his phone, fumbling with the keypad. He dialed the police, his voice shaking as he gave them the location and begged for immediate assistance. "We have to act fast," he said, glancing at the gorilla and the bear waiting nearby. "There's no time to waste." As he ended the call, Lucas stared at the hat in his hands. His father's name felt heavier now, carrying not just memories but questions that demanded answers. This wasn't just about saving the animals anymore. It was about uncovering the truth and facing whatever lay ahead. He gripped the brim of his father's hat, the feel of the frayed fabric grounding him amidst the chaos of his thoughts. The papers in his bag told one part of the story, a dark, twisted operation of greed and cruelty. The hat in his hands told another, a personal mystery that had haunted him for a decade. The low growl of the gorilla broke through Lucas's swirling thoughts. It stood beside the bear, both animals unusually alert. The air seemed to shift, carrying faint voices from somewhere deeper within the grounds. Lucas froze, his heart pounding as he strained to listen. "Need to burn the whole place down," a gruff voice muttered, sharp and clear against the eerie silence. Lucas crouched low, moving cautiously toward the sound. Peering around the edge of a dilapidated tent, he spotted them. Two men, dressed in dark clothes and carrying gas cans. They were rough-looking, their movements purposeful as they gestured toward the abandoned structures. "This has to happen tonight," the second man said, his tone low but urgent. "No trace left. No cages. No papers. Nothing." The first man nodded. "We'll torch it all, and the old Stephen. He's next if he doesn't give us what we need." Lucas's breath caught. The words struck him like a blow. The old Stephen. His father. He was alive. He clutched the hat tighter, his mind racing. The realization was both a relief and a fresh wave of terror. His father was out there, somewhere, still entangled in whatever monstrous plans these men had. And now they were planning to destroy everything, the evidence, the animals, and maybe even any hope of finding his father. Lucas felt a surge of anger rise in his chest. His fists clenched, his body trembling with the effort to stay hidden. But as he shifted to get a better view, his foot nudged a loose piece of metal debris. The sharp clang shattered the silence. Both men whipped around, their eyes narrowing. "Who's there?" one barked, pulling a flashlight from his belt and sweeping it across the shadows. Lucas ducked back, his heart racing. He pressed himself against the cold metal of the cage beside him, willing himself invisible. There. The beam of light found him, and the men charged forward. Lucas bolted, his legs propelling him across the uneven ground. The shouts of the men followed close behind, their footsteps heavy and quick. He darted around a pile of broken wood, nearly tripping as he scrambled toward the only direction he could think of, the animals. The gorilla and the bear were still near the cages, their eyes locked on the commotion. As Lucas sprinted past them, the two animals reacted almost instinctively. The gorilla charged first, its powerful frame barreling toward the nearest man. The force of its impact sent the man sprawling to the ground, his flashlight skidding out of reach. He let out a yell, his hands fumbling for something, anything, to defend himself. The bear followed, its massive size and injured body somehow moving with ferocity. It reared onto its hind legs, letting out a roar that echoed through the circus grounds. The second man froze, his face pale, before stumbling backward. Lucas stopped just long enough to see the chaos unfold. The animals, once prisoners of this place, now fought with a primal intensity. The gorilla swung its massive arms, driving the men away from Lucas. The bear's strength was awe-inspiring, but its injuries were taking a toll. "Come on!" Lucas shouted, his voice hoarse with urgency. "We have to get out of here!" The gorilla retreated toward him, but the bear faltered, collapsing onto its front legs with a pained grunt. Lucas's chest tightened. He couldn't leave it behind. "Hold on, big guy," he murmured, running to the bear's side. Its breaths were heavy, its body trembling with effort. Lucas placed a hand on its fur, looking into its eyes. "We'll get you out of this." The hum of engines cut through the oppressive silence of the abandoned circus, growing louder with each passing second. Lucas stood at the edge of the clearing, his breath catching in his throat as headlights pierced the dark. A convoy of vehicles pulled to a halt, and figures emerged, conservationists in green uniforms, followed by local police officers armed with determination and tools. Relief washed over Lucas like a wave, but it was fleeting. He turned toward the bear, who was lying on its side not far from him. Its chest rose and fell in labored breaths, its fur matted with blood from the earlier skirmish with the poachers. "Hang in there," Lucas murmured, crouching beside it. "Help's here." A woman approached, her face etched with both exhaustion and purpose. She knelt next to Lucas, her hands gentle but efficient as she examined the bear. "We'll do everything we can," she assured him. Her voice was calm, but the tight line of her mouth betrayed the urgency of the situation. Lucas nodded, swallowing hard. He stood and pointed toward the main tent. "There are more animals," he said, his voice hoarse. "Some still trapped. I couldn't get to them all." The woman signaled to her team, and within moments the rescuers spread out across the grounds, flashlights slicing through the gloom. Lucas followed a group heading toward the cages, his heart pounding. Inside the dilapidated tent, the scene was both harrowing and hopeful. The rescuers worked methodically, their tools clanging as they pried open rusted locks and dismantled bars. Lucas watched as they freed a tiger first, its once majestic coat now dull and marred with scars. The animal hesitated, its golden eyes flicking between the open cage door and the unfamiliar humans. "It's okay," one of the rescuers said softly, holding out a hand as though the tiger might understand the gesture. Slowly the creature stepped forward, its powerful frame trembling with both fear and newfound freedom. Nearby, a team worked to release a mother elephant and her calf. The calf's trunk curled protectively around its mother's leg, and Lucas felt his throat tighten at the sight. "How could anyone do this?" he muttered to himself. A flash of green and blue caught his eye, drawing him toward a smaller cage. Inside, a macaw perched on a bar, its vibrant feathers dulled with grime. It tilted its head as Lucas approached, letting out a soft squawk that sounded more like a plea than a protest. "Hang on," Lucas whispered, gripping the bars. A rescuer joined him, and together they worked to open the cage. The macaw flapped its wings once, awkwardly, as if it hadn't flown in years. Lucas gently extended his hand, and to his surprise, the bird hopped onto it. "You're free now," he said, his voice thick with emotion. Back in the clearing, the scene was chaotic, but purposeful. Crates and stretchers were being loaded into vehicles, each carrying a rescued animal. Some, like the tiger and elephant, moved on their own, guided by calm, experienced hands. Others, like the macaw and a small tortoise Lucas hadn't noticed before, required more delicate care. Through it all, Lucas's gaze kept returning to the bear. A veterinarian was working quickly, cleaning its wounds and administering an injection. "The damage is serious," she said to Lucas, not unkindly. "But it's strong. There's a good chance it'll pull through." Lucas stayed close, unwilling to leave its side. The bear, though weak, seemed aware of his presence. Its eyes, heavy-lidded and weary, locked onto his for a moment. Lucas felt a pang of gratitude so profound it was almost painful. "You saved me," he murmured. "Now it's my turn to save you." As dawn began to break, the last of the animals were loaded into the rescue convoy. Lucas stood by one of the vehicles, his bag clutched tightly in his hands. Inside were the documents he had found, evidence of the illegal trade that had brought so much suffering to this place. When a police officer approached, Lucas handed over the bag without hesitation. "This should help," he said. The officer flipped through the papers, his expression grim. "It's more than enough to start a full investigation," he said. "We'll follow this trail wherever it leads." Lucas nodded, exhaustion finally settling into his bones. But it wasn't the kind of exhaustion that begged for rest. It was the kind that came with knowing he'd done something that mattered. As the vehicles began to pull away, Lucas watched the bear being carefully loaded onto a stretcher. The macaw, now perched in a small enclosure, let out a soft, hopeful cry. Lucas smiled faintly, his heart heavy but full. For the first time in a long while, the forest felt lighter, as though it, too, was breathing a sigh of relief. But Lucas knew the work wasn't done. There were still questions to answer, still truths to uncover, and as the last vehicle disappeared into the trees, he made a silent vow. This wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. The early morning sun broke through a dense mist, painting streaks of pale gold across the horizon. Lucas sat on the front steps of his home, clutching his father's hat tightly in his hands. It had been days since the raid on the abandoned circus, but his mind refused to rest. Every detail of that night haunted him: the empty cages, the desperate animals, the names on those brittle papers. But more than anything, it was the discovery of his father's connection to it all that consumed him. A sharp buzz from his phone shattered the quiet. Lucas fumbled to answer it, his heart racing. "Lucas, it's Detective Ramirez," came a gruff voice on the line. "We've got a lead. Based on the documents you turned in, we've located the site. It's near the border, a warehouse just south of Brownsville. We believe your father is there." Lucas's breath caught. "He's alive?" "From what we've gathered, yes. But the situation is delicate. Stay put, and we'll handle the extraction. You've done enough." The call ended, leaving Lucas frozen in place. Relief surged through him, but it was tinged with fear. After years of uncertainty, there was finally hope. The rescue operation unfolded with precision. Lucas wasn't there to witness it as much as he wanted to be. The police insisted on keeping civilians away from the danger. Hours later, he received the news. His father had been found alive, though weak and visibly scarred. When Lucas arrived at the hospital, his father was sitting up in bed, his eyes heavy but alert. Time had etched lines into his face, and his frame was thinner than Lucas remembered, but there was no mistaking the man who had once guided him through those same woods. "Dad," Lucas whispered, his voice trembling. David Stephen turned toward the voice, his gaze softening as recognition dawned. "Lucas, my boy." The moment was brief before tears overtook them. Lucas held his father's frail hand, careful not to press too hard on the bruises that covered his skin. "They told me what happened," Lucas began cautiously. "The smuggling ring, the animals, the research. You were part of it." David shook his head. "Not by choice," he said, his voice hoarse. "They took me, Lucas, forced me to work for them. They knew I was a biologist, knew I understood animal genetics. They wanted me to manipulate endangered species, create hybrids for the black market. I resisted as much as I could. But—" He trailed off, his gaze dropping. Lucas's chest tightened. "But you're free now," he said firmly, "and we'll make sure they never do this again." David agreed to testify, his knowledge of the operation proving invaluable. Over the following weeks, investigators unraveled the full extent of the smuggling ring. The network spanned continents, involving not just animals, but illegal genetic experiments. The trial was swift and damning. "I never thought I'd live to see justice," David said one evening, sitting beside Lucas in their living room. The lines of stress on his face were softer now, though the scars, both visible and unseen, remained. "You made it happen," Lucas replied. "What you did, standing up, it changed everything." The consequences of their actions rippled outward. The ringleaders were sentenced to long prison terms, their sprawling network dismantled piece by piece. The documents Lucas had uncovered, combined with his father's testimony, ensured there would be no loopholes for them to escape through. But for Lucas, the victory wasn't just about punishing the guilty. It was about hope for the animals, for the world they lived in. The circus grounds, once a symbol of exploitation and cruelty, were transformed into a sanctuary. Conservationists and volunteers worked tirelessly to restore the area. The surviving animals were rehabilitated, some released back into the wild, while others remained in care, too broken by their past to fend for themselves. Lucas often visited the site, his heart heavy with the memory of the bear and the gorilla that had stood by him during that fateful night. He liked to imagine the bear had found a peaceful corner of the forest, living out its days free from pain and fear. The house was small but full of light, its windows open to let in the gentle breeze of early spring. Lucas sat at the kitchen table, his mother bustling quietly behind him. The scent of fresh-baked bread filled the air, mingling with the soft hum of an old radio playing in the corner. It felt surreal to be home, to sit in the same room where so many memories had been made. Yet this time, something was different. Across from him sat his father. David Stephen looked older than Lucas remembered, his once strong frame now thinner, his face lined with the marks of a decade lost to captivity. But his eyes, steady and kind, were just the same. "More tea, Dad?" Lucas asked, his voice steady but soft, as if speaking too loudly might shatter the moment. David nodded with a small smile. "Thank you, son." It was a simple exchange, but it carried the weight of years. Lucas poured the tea, his hands trembling slightly. His mother joined them, setting down a plate of cookies and resting her hand on David's shoulder. The three sat together, sharing stories, laughter, and the kind of silence that only comes with deep understanding. For the first time in years, Lucas felt a sense of completeness. His family was whole again. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of recovery and rebuilding. Lucas spent countless hours working alongside wildlife conservationists to ensure the rescued animals were given the care they needed. The gorilla, now affectionately named Saul, was recovering well in a sanctuary. The other animals, once malnourished and broken, were slowly regaining their strength. But Lucas's heart remained tied to one creature in particular. The brown bear had been transported to a wildlife rehabilitation center. Its wounds were healing, though it would bear the scars of its ordeal for life. Lucas visited as often as he could, sitting quietly by the bear's enclosure and watching it with a mix of admiration and gratitude. "You're going to be okay," he told it one afternoon, leaning against the wooden fence. The bear looked up at him, its amber eyes calm and knowing. Lucas liked to think they shared a mutual understanding, a bond forged in the forest and strengthened through everything that followed. Months later, the day finally came. Lucas stood at the edge of the forest, the morning sun casting long shadows across the ground. Beside him, the bear sniffed the air, its nose twitching as it caught the familiar scent of trees and earth. "This is it," Lucas said, his voice steady but thick with emotion. "You're going home." The bear turned its head, looking at him one last time. Lucas swallowed hard, a lump rising in his throat. He reached out, his fingers brushing the rough fur of its shoulder. "Thank you," he whispered, "for everything." The bear lingered for a moment, as if it understood. Then, with a final glance, it lumbered off into the trees. Lucas watched until its form disappeared into the shadows, his chest tight with both sorrow and joy. The forest seemed to breathe as it welcomed the bear back, its towering trees swaying gently in the breeze. Life took on a new purpose for Lucas after that. He began sharing his story, how a chance encounter with a brown bear led him to uncover a world of pain and hope. He spoke at schools, wildlife organizations, and even national conferences, his voice becoming a beacon for the fight to protect the voiceless. The media had dubbed him the man who followed the bear, a title he accepted with humility. He used it as a platform to raise awareness about the plight of endangered species and the importance of preserving their habitats. But Lucas never saw himself as a hero. He often said the real heroes were the animals, the ones who endured, who survived, and who inspired humans to be better. Years later, Lucas found himself back in the forest where it all began. The trees were taller now, their branches reaching higher into the sky. The air was cool and crisp, carrying the faint scent of pine. He walked slowly, his boots crunching against the leaf-strewn path. The forest felt alive, its silence welcoming rather than foreboding. He paused by the river, the very spot where he had crossed the rickety bridge behind the bear. Lucas smiled, his gaze drifting toward the horizon. He liked to imagine the bear was still out there, roaming freely, living the life it was always meant to have. As he stood there, the sun broke through the clouds, bathing the forest in golden light. It was a fitting reminder of the journey he had taken, not just through the woods, but through a story that changed him forever. Lucas adjusted the strap of his bag and turned back toward the trail. He knew he would return again and again to this place where freedom, hope, and connection had come alive. And somewhere, deep in the forest, he believed the bear would be waiting. Thank you for staying with me through this incredible journey. If this story moved you, I encourage you to reflect on how we can all play a role in creating a better world for the creatures we share it with. Whether it's supporting wildlife conservation, sharing stories like Lucas's, or simply appreciating the beauty of the natural world, every effort counts. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this video with someone who needs a little inspiration today. Let's spread the message that together we can make a difference. And as always, thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.